classical conditioning. In this picture, right, this is an image of The Office. This is a great clip, right, where Dwight is being conditioned with Altoids. So in class, we'll kind of see it. The video is available for you. I think it's a hot link, the picture is. So on the slides, you can kind of check it out. It's a little bit tougher to find the last few years, but nonetheless, many of your Office aficionados can find it. So let's start talking about it. So some terms that we need to be aware of for classical conditioning to kind of understand what it is that we're looking at, right? We've got the unconditioned stimulus, which is, if we're talking about Pavlov and his dogs, right? It's the meat powder, okay? So the stimulus can elicit the response without any learning, right? You don't need it. Okay, so you pour some meat powder on some dog food, the dog's going to eat it. The unconditioned response is salivation. So when the dog's getting ready to eat, or even humans as we're getting ready to eat, we start producing more saliva to break down our food. The conditioned stimulus, right? This is the bell, if you will, or the metronome. It was originally unable to elicit any response of salivation. It had no correlation to what we were looking to study, right? So it's conditioned. We created this association. And then the conditioned response is when the dog begins to salivate because of the conditioned stimulus. So we're making sure that once the conditioned stimulus is has been established, after we ring the bell or hit the metronome, the dog then salivates, much like they would before. And you can see at the bottom, conditioned is learned, right? That's what we have created. That's what we've learned. And then unconditioned, that's stuff that's just natural, innate, inborn, if you will. So here's one of many images that we'll see of the study that Dr. Pavlov did. So again, it wasn't the kindest. It kind of had bored little holes in the dog's cheeks, sort of, to put the vials to collect the saliva as they were doing the study. But nonetheless, they were able to kind of keep track of the amount of saliva created from both the unconditioned and conditioned stimuli to make sure that they were getting the results that they needed. So here's a good way of looking at it. Beforehand, food is the unconditioned stimuli, created the unconditioned response of preparing to eat or active salivary glands. Before conditioning, you could have hit the tuning fork, the metronome, the bell, whatever you want to call it, and nothing, right? Nothing happens with the dog. During conditioning, you pair the sound of the bell, metronome, you name it, you hit it, give them food, and then you get the response because food is paired with the, at that time, previously neutral stimulus. Then over time, you get the association so that formerly neutral stimulus now becomes a conditioned stimulus, right? You get the conditioned response. So take a look at some of these similarities to help you keep them straight. So remember, the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are looking to always be the same, right? Salivation from the dog food, salivation from the tuning fork. And then the neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus will always be the same. It's something that's completely neutral to start. It means it has no association, but we're trying to take something that has no association and give it an association. Okay. So then the ones that you'll have to remember are the unconditioned stimulus, and that's the first thing that was used to present to create the initial response. Okay. So that's kind of how you want to remember it. Okay. So some language, sorry, I think I might have put that in there twice. So that's the same one. So here we go again, right? This breaks it down. It gives you the example of stimulus that does not evoke a response, bell, meat powder, bell. But you see how the unconditioned, both the responses, okay, salivation, and the conditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus are both the bell. The only big change there is the meat powder. Okay, so being able to understand that many of them are going to overlap, and you don't have to remember all these different pieces. You just have to know which ones go where. So here's another picture of the same thing we've been talking about. Okay. Fun cartoon. So this is when it gets kind of interesting, because this is when taking a look at the research and the study of how do we actually create these associations. So you see the top one, we have forward delayed conditioning. Okay, conditioning occurs readily. So this is the best and most optimal way to condition. And that's where you have the conditioned stimulus. We'll just keep using the same thing, the bell, immediately followed by the unconditioned stimulus, food. So it goes bell, food, saliva, bell, food, saliva, bell, food, saliva. You do it enough, then you take the food away, you can go bell, saliva. Then you get a forward trace conditioning, meaning the conditioned stimulus is pushed further away from the unconditioned stimulus, okay? You can get the association, but it's not always as strong. So this would be like bell, food, saliva, bell, food, saliva, okay? Then you get an even more forward trace, and it gets even weaker. So the more time you have between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, the weaker your conditioning. Then you've got simultaneous, where you are essentially putting the food down and ringing the bell at the same time, and that is either weak or inconclusive, because the original unconditioned stimulus is present at the same time, so it's hard to draw a conclusion. And then you have backwards conditioning, okay, which you'd have the conditioned stimulus after the bell, after the food, and it is inconclusive to be able to identify whether that has any impact on saliva, okay? So some good predictors of kind of what you're going to see. You see the red line is the unconditioned stimulus, the blue line's the potential conditioned stimulus, and then the green is already established conditioned stimulus, right? So things that already happen. So the top one, a good predictor, right? Blue stimulus occurs just before most occurrences of the unconditioned stimulus, right? That's what we were just talking about. We've got the bell, food, bell, food. Poor predictor, flip it, okay? Food, bell. Doesn't work out very well. Another poor predictor is when you've got multiple random occurrences of the stimulus, because there's no real direct connection. So if you go bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, bell, there's no direct like, ooh, that means specifically this. And then redundant or blocking effect. Okay, so the green already established. So you're doing things that have already been established. So say you created, let's call it, maybe some of you are a cat, right? In the good old days, the electric can opener for the cat food. So you hit the can opener, and then you give them the unconditioned stimulus, right? So can opener, food, can opener, food. But now you've got can opener, bell, food, can opener, bell. So it won't really do much because you've already got the established conditioned stimulus, right? So it's trumping what you're trying to add in. So some other terms we want to go over is this idea of acquisition, right? You see the red on the far left. That's the period of time where your association or your pairing, as they have on there, is happening, where you're hitting the bell and then giving the food, hitting the bell, giving the food, hitting the bell, getting the food. So you're getting that acquisition started. Then what can we run into is extinction. That happens when we start to ring the bell and not deliver food. You can only do that so many times before, if you're looking at saliva, as this one is, before the amount of saliva produced drastically reduces. Okay, so after a while, the old dog's gonna be like, well, I'm not getting fed anymore, so I'm not gonna produce the saliva because I'm not expecting to eat. The cool stuff comes with these next two, the spontaneous recoveries. So you see how it drops all the way down to almost being fully extinct. But then all it takes is one more time to pair the bell and the food again, and you see how the saliva levels jump way back up. And then with extinction, you can let it drop down again, and then you get a little bit smaller recovery. Okay, so each recovery is going to be about half of what the last one was without more added pairings, right? Without more acquisition. So here it is again. Okay. So here's a fun thing to do. If you are at home, you can do this with a parent or a sibling, but you can take a water bottle and like a poncho or something and put it on the person so they don't get totally wet. But then read through this script and spray them with water every time you get to the bolded cans. And you'll be able to see everything from acquisition to extinction in the place where there aren't very many to spontaneous recovery at the very end. Okay, it's a fantastic, quick little experiment that's easy to do at home. Get a little spray bottle and a poncho or even a towel. Okay, so generalization. You know, this is when you're running into things that are similar, right, to what you're training, whether that be a bell or whatever your conditioned stimulus would be, similar to it, okay? And how close it gets in tones and frequencies allows it. So if there in the middle is your bell, bells that are similar where the other red and lighter orange are going to get a fairly close response. Then if you go over here to the far ends where the blue and the aqua and such are, maybe that's an alarm clock compared to a bell. You're not going to get nearly the same result. Okay. Okay, this is another great example. This is Little Albert. This is a John B. Watson experiment on classical conditioning where he used loud sounds paired with like white fuzzy creatures, if you will, to essentially conditioned a fear response in the child to things that were previously neutral and or possibly even enjoyable, right? Some of them were little rabbits and dogs, soft. The kid enjoyed playing with them. So check this out on your own time. Then we look at the kind of the discrimination. So discrimination is another idea or phenomenon where you're able to tell them apart. So that's where we're talking about the alarm clock versus the bell. So discrimination training is if you got your conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, and you built up conditioning. Then you've built it up to the point where you have no unconditioned stimulus, and you can get some generalization, okay? And then you start to get a little bit of extinction, and then after a while, you're able to tell that sound is not the same. Okay? You see at the bottom where they're using the circles. We got the circle and the oval, and you can tell them apart, right? After you've taken away the unconditioned stimulus, and you're only using the conditioned stimulus. The subject would be able to identify, discriminate in those differences between bell tones or whatever it is you're using. Okay. So some cool real-world applications, right? So one, taste aversion for control of predatory animals on farm animals. So what happens is these coyotes have been, preying, especially in the West, on chickens and small livestock. So there was a problem because the farmers were just shooting or trapping these coyotes and killing them. Well, we were starting to see dwindling numbers, so they created an experiment where they put dead animals, small dead animals, chickens or other small animals that may find around a farm, and they poisoned them with lithium chloride. Not deadly per se, but it made them really, really sick. Okay, so they would come and you'd have this animal that's already dead, that's been laced with this poison. They'd eat it, they get sick, and then they don't want to go back around those chickens or sheep or goats or whatever people had, because they had that strong evolutionary response to not want to get sick, so they would leave them alone, right? That was a really clever way of using conditioning to kind of regenerate the coyote population. Another way of looking at it is this old school bell and pad method to control bedwetting. So if a child is wetting the bed at night, what this contraption does is when you put the pad underneath the sheets, as soon as it starts to get wet, it sounds an alarm. Okay, the alarm wakes the child up, alerting them that, oh, I kind of have to pee a little bit. And then they get up and they go to the bathroom, right? So after a while, that alarm waking them up, go to the bathroom, they start to associate that same feeling with, I need to go to the bathroom, and you can kind of wean them off of the bell pad. Okay. Taste aversion is really interesting, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about it later on. But there's a good chance that you have experienced food poisoning at some point and are also experiencing taste aversion. Because typically if you eat or drink something and you associate that with making you ill, there's a really strong chance that you kind of avoid it, and or that same food that made you ill makes you ill just at the thought of it. Okay? So maybe it was something that you enjoyed eating, maybe it's something new that you tried, but oftentimes it takes a long time and sometimes never get past that feeling. So two interesting things about the conditioning principles of taste aversion. One, the first one is it does not need repeat pairing like the rest of conditioning. One time does the trick. Right? You get sick enough one time from eating something and you're hooked. Okay? And the time span defies what we talked about before of the pairing, right? Where you want them to be essentially butted right up to each other. It can be hours to still have this association be very, very strong. For instance, you eat at dinner, something that wasn't cooked very well, you're getting ready for bed 2, 3, 4 hours later and get very ill. Well, that still works. Okay, so a little bit different in that sense. Okay, so there's our intro into classical conditioning. We'll have a lot of practice